So we're going to work on parallel structure, but we're going to make it in the form of two speakers. So we're kind of adding it. It's not just one paragraph that says something. And, you notice that you have two different people speaking. So what you're supposed to look for is two different kinds of trains of thought. So you see here where it says during the 1970s, John Maynard Keynes was known for his philosophy of government support. Many other economic philosophers believed in laissez-faire or in non-governmental interference. During the 1970s, earnest stagflation caused the price of gold to fluctuate. Usually the price increased. Therefore, the government officials did permit the United States Central Bank Reserve to release money into the American economy. This caused Americans to spend money through housing, furniture, and food purposes. So you have these connections that are coming up that make it hard. Like you have government support. Then you have the opposite of it, non-governmental interference. Then you had gold's price. And you have this interesting word called stagflation, which if you don't know what it means slow but increasing inflation going up steady. So if you had a graph, your graph would kind of look like this. It would kind of go, okay, we're here, you get constant, no change, and then it would veer here, little change, stay here. But as you see, even though it's almost little change, it's still going up. So if you don't know what this word really means, stagflation, you still know kind of that it's some type of inflation that's going. And when you look at it as a context clue, it means that it caused the price of gold to fluctuate. And fluctuate means it changes. Now, most people will look at you and say, that's crazy because gold went up, but it did it over, a 40-year period, and it almost doubled. But you still have to keep in mind that the price of gold in 1970s is going to be different, honestly, for the price of gold now in 2025. So it changed, okay? And when you see this word fluctuate, if you don't understand what it means, it kind of, you have to get this, that you kind of have to, you might have to guess that it means to change. It means it didn't stay steady. Usually the price increased. Therefore, the government officials did permit the United States Central Bank to release money into the American economy. And this caused Americans to spend money through housing, furniture, and food. So you've got a very important word of spending money. Two words, actually. So you've got people wanted government support, and then at the end, government support occurred. So now you have to think, is David going to say something to agree, or is he going to say something that's opposite? So David says the gold standard ended in the 1970s. The United States government needed to replace the money it lost from high inflation in previous decades. John Keynes' theories did not influence the policy. The government needed to recoup funds that were spent on the Vietnam War. Therefore, stagflation continued. So I guess what David is saying, and I guess what you have to try to do is say, he's saying that stagflation existed, and that John was trying to say it was gone. And to be very honest with you, John only mentioned stagflation was still here. So this is kind of faulty logic. In fact, it's not kind of, it is. It's faulty logic. And David is not really agreeing with John. He's kind of saying, Yeah, but stagflation still continues, so the government did nothing. And this is where you have to think through what's really happening. That that David is pretty much saying it doesn't matter that the central bank released money into the American economy. Stagflation still continued. So he's kind of saying the money still stayed that way. So the question you're going to look at is going to ask you, how do they agree? And that's where we need to go and look at. Okay, so now that you look on this, you're looking at David and John disagree on which topic. So the author has already shown you that they disagree. And do they disagree on the use of the gold standard? Well, did they bring up the gold standard? Did John bring it up? He said he brought the cost of gold to fluctuate, but he didn't bring up the use of the gold standard. And if you were to use this word here to indicate that that was the gold standard, that would be faulty, because he stuck to the price of gold. The gold standard was actually a way of really using money as gold, but it was kind of like used internationally. So, it kind of said gold doesn't lose its value, and it was both political and economic. But this would be too broad, because this is really not a mention of the gold standard. So this can't be the answer. Okay, they disagree on the United States Central Bank Reserve's importance. Well, this David doesn't really bring up the central bank. He just says the United States needed to replace its money lost from high inflation in previous decades. So you can't really compare two things, because this was not mentioned by David. And so you really need to look at that and pay attention. Okay, I'm going to put ED here. Not mentioned by David. Okay, they disagree on the United States government's interference. And when we say interference here, laissez-faire means don't put your hands in this, leave it alone, let it work. And interference means, hey, come in and try to fix this. So it could be good interference, it could be bad interference. So here you are. They disagree on the United States interference. Well, look, here's David saying the government needed to recoup funds that were spent in Vietnam, and you'd have to make a kind of inference that he's saying, okay, that's good, they had to, but the stagflation continued. They needed to replace it. And then he comes out and says, yeah, but stagflation increased. And well, they didn't increase, but continued, because they still had to spend the funds that were spent on the Vietnam War. So he's kind of saying, like, even though they got involved, nothing really happened. Okay? So he said they did get involved, and he didn't make any other comments about, so C's out. And so that only leaves one answer, which is D. And you hear clearly he says stagflation continued. Whereas John uses stagflation as gold to fluctuate. Government officials did permit it to reserve to release money into the American economy. And he kind of goes back and says, so, once he did that, stagflation decreased. So that's your answer. But you have to make all these inferences, otherwise you won't get these right. And this is very hard. These questions are extremely hard. Because, if you then constantly talking about something else, because these questions are very, very hard, you do have to pay attention, or else you can get them wrong. So David and John agreed on which of the topics, so the author assumes that they agreed, and because of question answering, you go ahead and agree. If you want to get into a philosophy class and discuss it later, that's different. They agreed on John Keynes' philosophy of government support. David does not mention John Keynes, so that is out. They agreed on the government's actions to help the American economy. So we have here government officials determined the United States Central Bank to release money into the American economy, and here you have government needed to recoup funds that were spent in Vietnam. So this may be a possibility. They agreed on theories that influence governmental policy. Well, where are the theories other than John Maynard Keynes? There really isn't another theory coming out. And David's kind of directly saying he didn't influence policy. He had nothing to do with it. So C is out. Next one is they agreed that Americans needed more housing. This is too broad. Neither person says Americans needed housing. This word here, needed, is a nitpicky, tiny little thing, but it's way too broad. How do they need housing according to either one? John says they spent more money through housing, furniture, and food purposes. So you have an implication that they needed housing. Did say that some people were expanding their house. Some people could have had a house and went out and bought a 5-bedroom house when they already had 3. It doesn't get into that. Okay, and David, once again, doesn't mention housing. He mentions high inflation spent. It's not mentioned. Cross it out. Your answer is B. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, you know how to get a hold of us.